Hello, and welcome back. Today, we re-stepping into the Wild West, a place often romanticized in movies as a land of fearless cowboys and endless adventure. But the truth, daily life on the frontier was brutal, unforgiving, and nothing like the myths. Let's uncover why you wouldn't last a single day in the Wild West. Before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe to the channel if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. Tell me what time you're watching and from where. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world. And for a better experience, dim the lights and let the gentle hum of your fan keep you company. When people today think about the Wild West, they often imagine wide open skies, golden sunsets, and a lone rider moving calmly across the horizon. But the truth was that the land itself was the first and most merciless enemy, and it did not care whether you were a cowboy, a farmer, or a dreamer chasing fortune, because the environment of the West was waiting to humble you the moment you stepped onto its soil. The American frontier was not a gentle invitation to adventure, but a harsh test of endurance, with endless deserts that stretched further than tired eyes could see, jagged mountain ranges that loomed like stone giants, and weather that seemed designed to remind you that human beings were very small guests in a very large and indifferent world. Daytime in the desert was scorching, the sun hammering down with a heat so fierce that even strong men found themselves dizzy and disoriented, while livestock grew weak and water skins emptied far too quickly. And if you did not plan ahead, dehydration was more than an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Then, when the sun finally fell and you thought perhaps relief was near, the same desert that had roasted you during the day turned cold and bitter at night, dropping to temperatures that could leave your teeth chattering even if you huddled close to a campfire. And settlers often lay awake beneath thin blankets, wondering how a single place could manage to cook them and freeze them in the same 24 hours. Water was the lifeblood of survival, and yet it was as unreliable as a gambler's luck, because rivers ran dry, wells collapsed, and stagnant pools were often filled with bacteria or already claimed by thirsty animals that had no intention of sharing. Many newcomers from the east were shocked by just how rare clean water was, because they were used to streams, lakes, and wells that seemed plentiful back home. And suddenly, they found themselves measuring every sip, rationing every drop, and learning the hard way that a careless mistake in water planning could end a journey before it properly began. Food was not much kinder, because the land was not eager to provide, and instead of baskets of fruit or fresh bread, you were more likely to be chewing on hardtack that could chip, a tooth-salted jerky that tasted like leather, or beans that had been boiled until they were more mush than meal. Cooking was rarely about taste, it was about survival, and if you were lucky, you might catch a rabbit or a bird. But more often than not, meals were repetitive, bland, and eaten quickly before the desert winds blew sand into the pot. Dust storms were another terror entirely, rising out of nowhere and transforming the sky into a swirling brown wall that blinded eyes, choked lungs, and buried camps in minutes. And travelers caught in one could become hopelessly lost just a mile away from safety. The animals of the frontier were not friendly either, and while coyotes might seem harmless at first glance, their constant howling through the night was enough to drive weary settlers half mad with lack of sleep. And they were not shy about sneaking into camps to steal scraps of food. Rattlesnakes were a far more immediate danger, coiled silently in the brush until a careless step brought a fatal bite, and since doctors were rare and medicine was primitive, a rattlesnake. Bite was often a death sentence, delivered with a soft rattle and a flash of fangs. Buffalo, though majestic in size and appearance, were unpredictable, and if a herd decided to move, you either got out of the way or you were trampled under thousands of pounds of muscle and hooves. For settlers who grew up in the gentler climates of the East, with soft farmland, plentiful rain, and neighbors not too far away, the West felt like another planet altogether, one where the ground cracked under the sun, where nights seemed endless, where insects swarmed in clouds, and where the loneliness of the wide open land pressed down heavier than any saddle. There were no stores to run to when you ran out of flour, no electricity to cool you when the heat became unbearable, no heaters to warm your bones when the cold crept in, and absolutely no guarantees that you would even survive long enough to tell your story. Many people dreamed of adventure, but when they arrived, they realized that simply making it through a single day without collapsing from exhaustion, dehydration, or sheer despair was an adventure in itself. And yet, despite all of this, the land had a strange pull, a beauty wrapped in brutality, a promise buried beneath hardship, and that is why people kept coming, chasing opportunity in a place that seemed determined to break them. But let us be clear, the harsh land of the Wild West was not romantic, it was not forgiving, and for most modern people used to clean water, soft beds, and stocked refrigerators, surviving even one day out there would feel less like a storybook adventure and more like a rude awakening. If the harsh land of the Wild West was not enough to wear people down, the constant shadow of disease, lack of hygiene, and terrifyingly primitive medical practices was often what truly broke settlers. Because while movies show cowboys in shootouts and bandits robbing trains, the real killer was often something invisible, carried in dirty water, passed by a cough, or crawling through filthy camps. Towns that sprang up almost overnight during gold rushes or cattle booms were rarely planned with cleanliness in mind. So, sewage often ran openly in the streets, animals roamed freely, leaving behind mess, and water sources were easily contaminated, which meant outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever were as common as saloon brawls, only far deadlier. Imagine walking into a frontier town, hopeful for a fresh start, only to find that the nearest water supply was a muddy creek where horses drank, clothes were washed and sick, animals were dumped, and then imagine having no choice but to drink from it, because it was the only source available. Cholera could sweep through entire communities in days, leaving behind silent streets and hastily dug graves. And dysentery was the constant companion of wagon trains, where travelers shared poor sanitation and crowded conditions. Smallpox, one of the deadliest diseases of the time, moved silently between settlements, and vaccination, while available in theory, was often inconsistent, unreliable, or simply too late to make a difference. If you caught smallpox out on the trail, you faced not only agony, but also the stigma of being avoided like a curse, as communities sometimes cast the sick aside in desperation to save themselves. And if disease did not get you, accidents and injuries often did, and the medical help available was the kind that made even brave men tremble. Doctors, when you could find one, were often self-taught or barely trained, and many frontier sawbones had a reputation for being more dangerous than the illness itself, because surgery was performed with unwashed tools, dirty hands, and no concept of germs. Amputations were common, since the quickest way to stop an infection was simply to cut off the limb, and anesthesia was rare, meaning whiskey or a hard bite on leather was the only relief a patient could hope for. Bleeding and purging, outdated practices by then, were still popular with some doctors who believed letting blood out of a sick patient would restore balance. And if that sounds like torture, well, it often was. Opium, morphine, and laudanum were used liberally, which meant patients might not feel their pain for a while, but could easily become addicted. And mercury was sometimes prescribed, which only made things worse, since mercury poisoning destroyed bodies slowly. Hygiene was nearly non-existent in many places, and while bathhouses could be found in some growing towns, they were expensive luxuries. And for most settlers, bathing was rare, clothing was rarely washed, and lice and fleas were everyday companions. The smell of an average camp or settlement was something modern noses would not tolerate. With sweat, unwashed clothes, animal manure, and spoiled food all mixing in the air. And since perfume was a luxury, people simply endured it, though enduring did not make it pleasant. Dental care was another nightmare, as toothaches were common thanks to poor diet and bad hygiene. And the most common solution was to pull the tooth entirely, often with crude tools that guaranteed more pain than relief. Newcomers from cities in the East often assumed they could handle rough living, but they were not prepared for the reality of watching neighbors drop suddenly from fevers or listening to the gut-wrenching sound of a child coughing endlessly from tuberculosis in a one-room cabin with no medicine that could truly help. Frontier mothers often relied on herbal remedies passed down through tradition, and while some of those actually provided relief, many were simply hopeful guesses, leaving families clinging to faith rather than actual cures. The problem was not just that medicine was primitive, it was that distance made help almost impossible to reach in time, because even if a skilled doctor existed in a nearby town, by the time a rider fetched him and returned, the patient could already be dead or beyond saving. People today complain about waiting a few hours in an emergency room, but in the Wild West, an emergency could mean waiting days with a festering wound, hoping infection did not spread faster than a horse could gallop. And all of this was made worse by the sheer exhaustion of daily life. Because when you are constantly overworked, underfed, and sleeping in uncomfortable places, your body has no energy left to fight off sickness, which meant minor colds could become pneumonia, minor cuts could become deadly infections, and childbirth, something common in every settlement, was among the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Mortality rates for mothers and infants were painfully high, and there were no proper hospitals, only midwives doing their best with what little knowledge they had. It is no wonder then that many pioneers carried an almost constant sense of dread about sickness, because it was invisible, unstoppable, and unmerciful, and unlike a bandit or a rattlesnake, you could not see it coming until it was already inside your home. For anyone romanticizing the Wild West, the truth is that survival was not just about dodging bullets. It was about surviving diarrhea, infections, fevers, and the terrifying roll of chance that came with every drink of water or every sneeze in the next bunk. And when you think about modern life with clean running water, antiseptics, antibiotics, dentists, and warm showers, it becomes clear why people today would not last long in that world. Because the Wild West was less about glamorous gunfights and more about holding your breath, hoping disease passed you by, and praying you would see another sunrise. When people imagine the Wild West, they usually picture a world filled with fearless gunslingers, quick-draw duels at high noon, and sheriffs bravely holding the line against dangerous outlaws. But the reality of lawlessness and violence was not glamorous or cinematic. It was terrifying, exhausting, and for most ordinary settlers, it was simply a fact of daily life that kept nerves on edge from sunup to sundown. Towns that sprang up quickly often had no formal government or police structure, which meant that order depended on whoever was willing to carry a gun and shout the loudest, and more often than not, that person was not exactly trustworthy. Sheriffs existed, yes, but many were underpaid, undertrained, and badly outnumbered, which meant they could do little more than chase drunks out of saloons or write down who had shot whom after the fact. Justice on the frontier was often swift, but it was rarely fair because vigilante groups could form overnight, dragging accused criminals into the street. And sometimes those accused were guilty, but other times they were simply unlucky or disliked. And a lynching tree was often quicker than a courthouse. Outlaws were not mythical figures, like the movies suggest. They were desperate men, sometimes former soldiers after the Prover Civil War, sometimes failed farmers, sometimes just opportunists, who discovered that robbing a stagecoach was easier than tilling dry land. And they were not shy about violence. Stagecoach robberies, train holdups, and raids on small towns were real threats, and travelers lived with the fear that around the next bend in the road, masked riders could appear demanding everything from coin purses to boots. Inside towns, saloons were both the social hub and the most dangerous place to spend an evening, because strong whiskey mixed with bad tempers led to brawls that could erupt over something as small as a crooked card or a spilled drink. Broken bottles, swinging fists, and the occasional gunshot filled the smoky rooms where music tried and failed to drown out the chaos. A cowboy might enter for a drink and leave with a black eye, missing teeth, or worse, and the sheriff could do little more than drag the unconscious out into the dirt to cool off. Gunfights were real, but not nearly as dramatic as Hollywood suggests, because most shootouts were messy, sudden, and usually involved people firing wildly until one or both collapsed, rather than carefully staged duels under the sun. Bullets did not discriminate, and bystanders often found themselves wounded or killed simply because they were standing too close when tempers boiled over. Settlers on lonely ranches or farms were even more vulnerable because they lived miles away from help, which meant raiders could steal cattle, burn homes, or terrorize families with no fear of quick retaliation. The feeling of being unsafe was constant, like a shadow following you everywhere. And even if weeks passed peacefully, everyone knew trouble could arrive without warning. Imagine trying to sleep in a creaky cabin while knowing that bandits, hostile strangers, or even your own neighbors might decide to settle grudges in the dead of night. And you can understand why settlers lived with exhaustion etched into their faces. Even disputes between neighbors could escalate into deadly feuds, sometimes dragging on for years, with families caught in endless cycles of revenge that made entire communities dangerous to live in. It was not unusual for people to carry guns simply as part of daily dress, not because they wanted to look heroic, but because danger lurked everywhere, and having a weapon felt like the only insurance policy worth trusting. Travelers told stories of being stopped by strangers who offered a smile with one hand and held a revolver with the other, and many knew better than to resist, because in the Wild West, losing your money was far better than losing your life. The irony is that most people who lived in the Uck's West were not looking for fights at all. They wanted peace, land, and opportunity. but the sheer lack of law enforcement, combined with desperate poverty and greed, meant that violence was baked into daily survival. Outsiders often imagined the West as a place of freedom, but that freedom came at the price of constant insecurity, because when the law is weak, chaos is strong. For modern people used to calling the police and expecting a quick response, the idea of living in a world where justice depended on whether your neighbors liked you or whether a mob was in a good mood would be more than unsettling, it would be unbearable. The truth is that lawlessness was not a romantic backdrop for adventure. It was a grinding reality that made every argument potentially deadly. Every trip into town a gamble, and every night's sleep a victory in itself. And that is why surviving even one day in the wild West required not only courage, but also luck, patience, and perhaps the wisdom to know when to keep your head down and your mouth shut. Life in the Wild West was not just about dramatic gunfights or dusty trails. It was mostly about the endless daily grind of simply trying to survive. And for many settlers, this meant long days filled with back-breaking work that left muscles aching, spirits weary, and hopes often crushed under the sheer weight of exhaustion, because nothing came easily on the frontier. Farming was one of the most common pursuits, but the soil was often dry, rocky, and uncooperative, which meant planting crops was less a matter of skill and more a gamble with nature, and the result was usually meager harvests that barely fed a family, let alone provided surplus to sell. Rainfall was unreliable, sometimes vanishing for months, sometimes arriving in sudden floods that destroyed everything. So farmers lived in a constant cycle of either praying for clouds or begging the skies to stop. Ranching was no easier because cattle and horses needed space, grass, and water, all of which were scarce. And a single drought could wipe out entire herds, while rustlers, predators, and sheer accidents added more risk than reward. Miners drawn by the dream of striking gold or silver spent endless hours underground in dark, dangerous tunnels filled with dust, gas, and the ever-present threat of collapse. And most never found riches, only injuries and lungs ruined by breathing rock dust. Daily food was repetitive and far from satisfying, because supplies were limited and preservation was difficult. So beans, cornbread, jerky, and coffee made up the bulk of diets. And if you were lucky, you might add a bit of bacon or wild game. But more often than not, meals were bland, hard, and eaten in silence after a long day. Imagine chewing on tough jerky while staring at a horizon that stretched endlessly, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same food and the same struggle, and you can understand why the excitement of frontier life faded quickly. Homes were rarely comfortable because building materials were scarce, and many settlers lived in sod houses, dugouts, or shacks that barely held together, which meant summers were unbearably hot, winters bone-chillingly cold, and rainstorms transformed roofs into leaking nightmares that soaked everything inside. Privacy was almost non-existent in one-room cabins where entire families slept, cooked, and worked together, and boredom often gnawed at people as much as hunger did, because entertainment was rare, books were few, and neighbors were often miles away. Loneliness was one of the quietest but most devastating struggles, especially for those who left family behind in the East, because letters took weeks or months to arrive, and the isolation of endless plains made many feel forgotten by the world. The physical labor never stopped, because even simple tasks like fetching water could mean hauling heavy buckets from distant wells, chopping wood for hours to keep a fire alive, or walking miles just to buy or trade for basic goods. And all of this work came with constant danger, because accidents were common and medical help was far away, so a broken bone, a deep cut, or a crushed hand from farm equipment could quickly become life-threatening. Even children were expected to contribute tending animals, collecting firewood, or working in fields, which meant childhood was short and responsibility came early, often leaving young people as weary and hardened as their parents by the time they were teenagers. Clothing wore out quickly, and replacing it was not easy, so people patched garments repeatedly until they were more stitch than fabric. And shoes often had to last far longer than they were ever meant to, which meant blisters, sore feet, and endless discomfort were part of every journey. And let us not forget the ever-present battle with pests, because flies, mosquitoes, lice, and bedbugs made daily life itchier and more irritating than anyone cared to admit. While rodents invaded pantries and snakes sometimes slithered a little too close for comfort. Entertainment, when it could be found, was usually limited to community dances, church gatherings, or the occasional traveling show. But most days ended with people too tired to enjoy anything more than collapsing into a hard bed or even onto the ground. Modern people, who complain when the internet is slow or when the air conditioning is a little too cold, would likely find themselves broken in spirit within hours of facing the endless chores, tasteless meals, leaky roofs, and aching loneliness that defined frontier survival. And yet, settlers carried on day after day because there was always the hope that tomorrow might bring a better harvest, a lucky strike in the mine, or even just a letter from back home. And that fragile hope was often the only thing stronger than the dust, the hunger, and the endless grind. Life in the Wild West was not just about fighting the land or enduring loneliness. It was also about navigating the constant tension of encounters and conflicts with other people and cultures, because the frontier was a meeting place of dreams and desperation, and wherever such different worlds collided, trouble was rarely far behind. One of the most complex and painful realities of the West was the relationship between settlers and Native American tribes, which has been turned into 1,000 myths, but in reality was a story filled with fear, misunderstanding, violence, and the loss of entire ways of life. Native tribes had lived on the land for centuries, moving with the seasons, hunting buffalo, and developing rich cultures, but settlers arrived with wagons, fences, and the idea of permanent ownership, which clashed with traditions of shared land and mobility. For the settlers, native tribes were often viewed as threats, while for the tribes, settlers were invaders, disrupting the delicate balance of survival. And this clash often exploded into raids, ambushes, and brutal counterattacks. Wagon trains moving westward were especially vulnerable, because long lines of slow-moving families were easy targets for both bandits and native warriors defending territory, and travelers often spent sleepless nights imagining the sound of hooves in the distance and fearing what morning might bring. But these encounters were not always violent, because trade also existed, and settlers sometimes exchanged goods like tools, cloth, or guns for food, furs, and knowledge of the land. And in those moments, there was at least a fragile peace, though it rarely lasted long. Beyond native conflicts, settlers also faced trouble from bandits, outlaws, and raiders, who saw isolated wagons, small towns, or lonely ranches as easy pickings. And when a group of armed men appeared demanding supplies, there was little anyone could do but hand over what they had and pray that the raiders would leave without adding bloodshed. Mexican bandits along the border, ex-soldiers from the Civil War drifting without purpose, and even former settlers who turned to crime out of desperation created a dangerous mix of threats that could appear without warning. And while some settlers imagined that cowboys and Indians were the great conflict of the West, the truth was that many dangers came from within communities themselves. Because cultural tensions ran high as immigrants from different countries all tried to carve out space in the same rough environment. Irish, German, Chinese, Mexican, and African American settlers all worked the land, built railroads, or opened small businesses, but prejudice and competition often turned neighbors into rivals, and violence could erupt as easily from insults and suspicion as from outright crime. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, for example, brought thousands of Chinese laborers who endured harsh conditions, low pay, and constant discrimination and resentment from other workers, sometimes spilled into attacks that left entire camps divided. Mining towns were especially volatile, filled with men from all over the world chasing riches, which meant tempers flared, arguments over claims escalated, and gunfire often decided who controlled the next patch of dirt. Even within families and small communities, conflicts could fester, turning into long-running feuds where grudges were passed down through generations, and violence became a twisted form of tradition. Encounters on the open trail were no less nerve-wracking, because strangers were rarely just strangers. They were potential threats, and a traveler had to decide quickly whether to trust a smile, a handshake, or an offer to share a campfire, because the wrong choice could cost you everything. Imagine sitting around a fire with someone you just met, trying to decide whether the glint in his eye meant friendship or danger, all while the darkness of the prairie stretched endlessly around you, and you will understand why nerves stayed frayed. For women, the dangers were multiplied because they were not only expected to work just as hard as men, but also had to guard themselves from harassment, abuse, and the constant risk of being left vulnerable in a violent and unstable world. Conflicts were not only physical, but also emotional, because the loneliness of the frontier often meant small disagreements grew larger than they needed to. And without the social structure of established towns, people sometimes settled disputes with fists or guns instead of words. For all of Hollywood's talk about brave heroes riding in to save the day, the real West was messy, tense, and unpredictable, and conflicts were less about good and evil than they were about fear, desperation, and survival in a place that gave little room for error. If you think about how modern people become stressed when a neighbor plays loud music, or when a stranger cuts in line at the grocery store, imagine how those same people would react if every encounter carried the risk of robbery, betrayal, or violence. And you will see why surviving in the West required not just strength, but also constant vigilance. In truth, encounters and conflicts shaped the very character of the frontier, carving into every settlement a sense of suspicion and resilience. And they remain one of the clearest reasons why most modern people, dropped suddenly into that world, would probably not last very long before wishing for the comfort of locked doors, friendly police officers, and neighbors who only argue about lawn care instead of pulling guns at dawn. When most people today picture the Wild West, their minds immediately jump to images shaped by Hollywood and old novels, scenes filled with rugged cowboys riding into dusty towns, dramatic duels at high noon, saloons packed with gamblers and piano music, and heroic lawmen facing off against notorious outlaws. But the reality was far less glamorous and much more exhausting, dirty, and often disappointingly mundane, which is why most modern people would probably last about 12 hours before begging to go home. The cowboy, for example, has become one of the most iconic symbols of the West. But in truth, very few people actually lived the cowboy life, and those who did often found it brutal and thankless, because it was not about adventure, but about long days herding cattle in blistering heat, freezing cold, or endless rain, all while eating little more than beans and coffee and sleeping under the stars, with nothing but a blanket and maybe a saddle for a pillow. There were no epic gun duels for them, only sore muscles, stampedes, and the constant fear of losing livestock to rustlers or storms. And most cowboys were teenagers or young men earning low wages for a job nobody else wanted. Hollywood also loves to show saloons as glamorous gathering spots filled with flashing smiles, poker tables stacked with gold, and daring shootouts, but in truth, saloons were often filthy, smelly, and dangerous, with watered-down whiskey, gambling cheats, and drunken brawls that ended in broken jaws rather than dramatic pistol duels. And the myth of the noble gunslinger facing down his rival in a fair fight at noon is one of the biggest exaggerations, because most violence in the West was not cinematic at all, but rather messy, fueled by alcohol, and often involving ambushes or multiple men shooting wildly until bystanders got hurt. If you strolled into a saloon expecting to be a dashing hero, chances are you would end up broke, bruised, or worse. And you would certainly not look like the movie stars that shaped the legend. Another myth is the idea that the West was filled with glamorous outlaws like Jesse James or Billy the Kid. But in truth, most criminals were desperate drifters or petty thieves whose lives were short, brutal, and largely forgotten. And while dime novels and later films turned them into legends, the actual experience of living near lawlessness was terrifying rather than exciting. The same goes for sheriffs and marshals, who are often remembered as brave men with shining badges keeping order. But in reality, they were often undermanned, underpaid, and overwhelmed because a single sheriff could not possibly control a town filled with drunks, gamblers, and armed troublemakers. And so frontier justice lynch mobs, vigilantes, and revenge killings was far more common than courtroom trials. Another myth is that everyone was armed and constantly looking for trouble, when in truth, most settlers were simply tired, overworked farmers, miners, or shopkeepers who wanted peace and survival, not drama, and who spent their days worrying about weather, disease, and food shortages instead of dueling rivals in the street. Life expectancy was low, hygiene was terrible, and most people had little time for adventure because they were too busy hauling water, patching roofs, or praying that their crops would not fail. Even the iconic image of pioneers riding proudly in wagons across wide-open plains glosses over the misery of endless dust hunger and broken wheels that made every mile a test of endurance with death and despair, often riding alongside families who dreamed of a better life but found only hardship. The myth that the Wild West was a place of constant excitement ignores the reality that much of it was repetitive, lonely, and filled with disappointment. And if you stripped away the legends, what remained was a life of hard labor, poor living conditions, and constant risk. For modern people who enjoy streaming movies, scrolling through phones, or ordering food delivered in 30 minutes, the idea of giving all that up for a life where even a cup of clean water required hours of work seems almost laughable. The truth is that the Wild West was not a grand adventure, but a harsh struggle for survival, where the romantic stories of cowboys, gunfights, and saloons were rare exceptions, and the ordinary reality was far more about dirt, sweat, hunger, and exhaustion. If you imagine yourself waking up in that world, with no electricity, no medicine, no comfortable bed, and no guarantee of safety, you can begin to understand why most of us would not last even one day, because legends may inspire, but reality has a way of grinding down even the strongest spirit, and the Wild West was far more reality than legend. When people today think about traveling, they often imagine comfortable cars gliding smoothly down highways air-conditioned, buses with cushioned seats, or airplanes whisking them across continents in a matter of hours. But in the Wild West, the very idea of travel was something entirely different, because it was not about convenience or speed or entertainment. It was about raw endurance, physical punishment, and the constant nagging fear that each mile might be the one where disaster struck. And this alone is one of the strongest reasons why most modern people would not last a single day in that world. The iconic image of Western travel is the covered wagon, sometimes called a prairie schooner. And while art and film often show them as almost romantic symbols of freedom, the truth was far less glamorous, because these wagons were wooden boxes on wheels, lacking suspension, lacking comfort, and prone to breaking down at the worst possible moment. A family wagon was usually packed to the brim with food, tools, bedding, spare wheels, and sometimes even livestock, which meant there was rarely any room for actual passengers. So people walked alongside the wagons for miles on end, their feet blistering, their backs aching, and their patience worn down by the endless creaking of wood and the groaning of animals pulling far too much weight. On a good day, a wagon might cover 15 miles, and that was considered a victory, which meant that journeys stretched into weeks, then months, and by the time settlers arrived at their destination, if they arrived at all, they were often gaunt, sunburned, and utterly exhausted. If you think about how frustrated people today become when traffic slows them down for 30 minutes, imagine what they would say if the best-case scenario was crawling through dusty terrain at the speed of a jogger, while rattlesnakes, wolves, and bandits waited patiently for the first sign of weakness. Wagon wheels broke with alarming regularity, and although many families carried spares, replacing a wheel was not as simple as calling roadside assistance. It meant hours of sweating under the sun, lifting and hammering and praying that the new wheel would hold out longer than the last one. Axles cracked, canvas covers tore in the wind, and animals collapsed in the heat, and every mishap meant another delay, another ration of food lost, and another wave of despair among travelers who were already clinging to hope with white knuckles. Stagecoaches promised greater speed, and they did manage to cover more miles per day, sometimes up to 70 or 80, if the route was good and the horses fresh. But the cost of that speed was bone-shaking discomfort, because stagecoaches rattled and jolted over every rock and rut, throwing passengers against each other until bruises bloomed like badges of honor. Seats were narrow, air was suffocating, and meals were rushed. Stops at crude roadside stations where food often tasted worse than hardtack pulled from your own wagon. Bandits knew stage routes well, and passengers always rode with one ear tuned to the possibility of gunfire and shouts demanding valuables, because coaches carrying mail and money were prime targets. There are stories of passengers stumbling out of stagecoaches at their final stop and kissing the ground, not out of sentimentality, but out of sheer relief that their bones were still intact and their belongings still in their possession. Then came the railroads, the great promise of progress, which did transform the West by shrinking journeys from months to days. But even the early trains were far from comfortable, because the cars were crowded, noisy, and filled with smoke that stung the eyes and coated everything in soot. Sparks flying from engines often set dry prairie grass ablaze, and tracks laid hastily by overworked crews sometimes buckled or gave way, sending trains lurching or derailing entirely. And yet, despite the dangers, trains felt miraculous compared to wagons and stagecoaches. So much so that settlers accepted the risks with a kind of weary gratitude. But not everyone could afford train tickets, and many families continued to drag their wagons across hostile landscapes, trading comfort for affordability. River crossings were among the greatest challenges, because there were no bridges across most rivers in the frontier. So wagons had to be floated on rafts or driven directly into the current, and one mistake could mean drowning, losing supplies, or watching helplessly as oxen were swept away. A single river could undo months of progress, and many travelers reached the far bank with fewer possessions, fewer animals, and in some cases, fewer family members. Mountains posed another nightmare, with narrow passes where one misstep could send wagons tumbling into canyons, and sudden snowstorms could trap entire groups until food ran out. The infamous Donner Party is remembered for its tragic ending, but they were not alone in underestimating the deadly power of the Sierra Nevada or the Rocky Mountains, and countless others froze, starved, or simply vanished. Roads, when they existed, were little more than ruts carved by the wagons before you, which meant that mud after a storm could swallow. Wheels so deeply that entire groups had to dig and push for hours to move a few feet, and dust in dry weather coated every surface, stung eyes, and clogged lungs, until breathing felt like chewing sand. Animals, the engines of the West, required constant care, because oxen, mules, and horses were the difference between progress and collapse. But they tired. They grew lame and they died, and when that happened, families faced impossible choices about whether to wait trade or abandon dreams altogether. Water was never guaranteed, and travelers sometimes went days rationing a few drops, only to find that the next stream was brackish, stagnant, or crawling with disease. Nights offered little comfort, because bedding was thin, the ground was hard, and the sounds of coyotes and wolves made sleep fitful at best. Fires gave warmth, but also drew attention, so travelers often sat in the dark, clutching rifles and whispering prayers that nothing would find them. Bandits and raiders struck without warning, and while wagon trains traveled in groups for protection, this also meant that the pace was slowed to the speed of the weakest, and arguments often flared among weary families about who was holding everyone back. Children trudged for miles, their shoes wearing down to tatters, while women balanced domestic duties with the same brutal labor as men. And boredom gnawed at everyone in the long stretches between dangers. Entertainment was non-existent, except for songs sung around fires or the occasional joke traded on the trail. But most of the time, silence reigned. broken only by the creak of wheels and the groans of animals. Imagine today asking people who complain about delayed flights to instead walk 20 miles under a blazing sun, carrying water in buckets, sleeping in the dirt, and facing the real possibility of dying before reaching their destination. And you begin to understand why modern people would crumble instantly. Even something as simple as navigation was a challenge, because maps were often incomplete, trails shifted, and landmarks could be misleading, which meant that wrong turns added weeks to a journey or led families into dead ends that sapped their supplies. Many relied on experienced guides, but guides could be unreliable or even dishonest, and one bad decision could doom everyone. The physical toll of travel etched itself onto bodies and faces, leaving people years older than they were. And the psychological toll was just as heavy, because every mile carried the weight of uncertainty. Would the next day bring water or drought, safety or attack, progress or catastrophe? For settlers, there was no way to know, and they carried on only because stopping meant certain failure. The irony is that the very act of movement, which we take for granted today as something easy and even enjoyable, was one of the greatest barriers to survival in the West. And it required a combination of strength, patience, and sheer stubbornness that most modern people have never had to call upon. Traveling in the Wild West was not an adventure story. It was a battle against distance, weather, hunger, and fear, repeated every single day until the end of the journey or the end of hope, whichever came first. And this is why, if someone from today were dropped into that world, handed the reins of a wagon or a seat in a stagecoach, they would very likely give up within hours, overwhelmed by dust, bruises, thirst, and the realization that survival meant months of this misery, with no guarantee of success, because the Wild West did not care about dreams, only about endurance, and only the most stubborn souls managed to keep moving forward. When people imagine the Wild West, they often picture small towns springing up almost magically, with wooden buildings lined neatly along a dusty main street, a swinging saloon door at the center, a sheriff's office nearby, and a church bell ringing proudly. But the reality of building communities in that environment was anything but magical, and it was one of the most grueling tasks settlers faced, because turning an empty stretch of prairie, desert, or mountain pass into a functioning town required a mix of back-breaking labor, improvisation, cooperation, and more than a little luck. The very first challenge was simply deciding where to build, because water was scarce, fertile land was patchy, and safety was never guaranteed. So groups of settlers had to choose locations carefully, weighing the risks of hostile raids, the chances of attracting trade, and the proximity to rivers or trails. Even when a spot seemed promising, the land itself rarely cooperated, because soil could be too hard to plow, weather too extreme, or storms too destructive. And yet people persevered, because the dream of a community carried with it the hope of stability, protection, and a future. The earliest structures were usually crude shelters, sod houses, or hastily built wooden shacks that barely held together in the wind, let alone against heavy rain or snow, which meant that comfort was sacrificed for speed. And many families spent their first months sleeping in drafty huts with leaky roofs and dirt floors that turned to mud whenever storms rolled through. Fires were constant threats, because dry timber and straw roofs ignited easily. And with no organized fire brigades, a single spark could reduce half a town to ashes in an afternoon. Rebuilding after such disasters was demoralizing but necessary, and settlers quickly learned that survival meant accepting constant setbacks. Beyond housing, communities needed gathering places, and almost without fail, the saloon was one of the first businesses to appear, because weary settlers craved a place to drink, gamble, and momentarily forget their struggles. The saloon became the beating heart of many towns, but it also brought problems. Because drinking led to brawls, brawls led to violence, and violence often spilled into the street. Alongside saloons, general stores emerged, selling overpriced but essential goods like flour, beans, tools, and sometimes luxury items brought in at great expense. And these stores were lifelines for settlers who could not produce everything themselves. Churches were also built quickly, not only for religious purposes, but also as community centers, schools, and meeting halls, because settlers knew that moral guidance and education gave structure to otherwise chaotic lives. Still, the very act of building was relentless work, because every board had to be cut, every nail hammered by hand, and supplies were scarce, which meant buildings often leaned awkwardly or looked half-finished, giving many towns the appearance of being temporary even after years of existence. Roads were little more than packed dirt, turning to mud in rain and dust in dry weather, and sidewalks were often wooden planks that creaked underfoot. Sanitation was nearly non-existent, because outhouses dug too close to water sources contaminated wells, garbage piled in alleys, and animals roamed freely, leaving behind smells that clung to every breeze. Disease spread quickly in such conditions, and cholera or dysentery could wipe out dozens in a matter of days, reminding everyone how fragile their communities really were. Social tensions also simmered beneath the surface, because towns were melting pots of ex-soldiers, fortune seekers, immigrants from Europe and Asia, freed slaves, and native people forced to adapt to encroaching settlements. And while diversity sometimes brought cooperation, it also sparked suspicion, prejudice, and violence. Mining towns in particular were volatile, with men from around the world jostling for claims, drinking hard, and settling disputes with fists or guns, and women who were far fewer in number found themselves both highly valued and highly vulnerable in such male-dominated environments. Brothels sprang up quickly, reflecting the imbalance of gender and the desperation of miners, who sought comfort after long days underground. And while these establishments thrived, they also highlighted the struggles women faced in carving out their roles in a harsh world. Schools were often single-room shacks, with one teacher handling dozens of children of all ages. And education was as much about discipline and survival skills as it was about reading or arithmetic. Entertainment beyond the saloon was rare, though traveling performers, circuses, or preachers sometimes passed through, offering a brief taste of culture before moving on. Law enforcement was another fragile pillar of community life, because sheriffs were often elected more for reputation than ability, and they worked alone or with minimal help, trying to impose order in towns where most men carried guns and tempers were short. Frontier justice often replaced formal trials, with mobs deciding fates quickly and brutally, which meant that fairness was more a matter of luck than principle. Yet despite the constant violence, many settlers longed for a sense of order, and they attended church, sent their children to school, and built fences around their property as if to declare that civilization could indeed take root in the wilderness. Economic survival depended on trade and towns that lay along wagon routes or near railroads thrived more than those in isolated areas. But even prosperous towns were vulnerable to collapse. If a mine ran dry, a railroad bypassed them, or crops failed. Ghost towns litter the American landscape today as reminders of how fleeting success could be, because entire communities packed up and left when fortunes turned, leaving behind weathered buildings and empty streets that once rang with laughter, music, and argument. Modern people, used to stable supermarkets, reliable plumbing, and consistent electricity, would likely be horrified by the fragility of frontier towns, where a single drought, a single epidemic, or a single fire could undo years of labor. To survive in such places required constant effort and the willingness to rebuild again and again. And while movies often show the Wild West as a place of freedom and excitement, the truth is that community life was defined by monotony, hardship, and the fragile balance between hope and despair. Every day was a gamble, every improvement a small victory, and every loss a reminder of how close settlers lived to the edge. And yet these communities did endure, sometimes growing into the great cities we know today, proving that human stubbornness and the dream of stability could overcome even the harshest odds. Though for modern people dropped suddenly into that reality. The absence of modern conveniences, the constant danger, and the sheer labor of keeping a town alive would almost certainly break them long before they had the chance to hammer their first board into place.